Welcome, Initiate. The official record calls Konrad Curze the Night Haunter, the first murderer. A Primarch so broken by madness that the Imperium had no choice but to have him killed. A monster who deserved his fate. That is a pretty convenient story, don't you think, Initiate? Because in the grim darkness of the far future, the stories that comfort everyone are usually the ones hiding something unbearable. And the story of Konrad Curze hides something the Imperium has spent 10,000 years making sure you never ask out loud. Because he wasn't condemned for his methods, he was condemned for his honesty. To understand this, you need to know what Nostromo actually was. Not a tragic backstory, but a laboratory. Curze's pod landed on a world of perpetual darkness, a hive of crime where the only law was the blade. He grew up alone, a feral child who learned quickly that the only thing cutting through that darkness was absolute, paralyzing fear. So he became Batman. Sorry, Council, I wouldn't do it again. He became the Night Haunter. He didn't just punish criminals, he turned them into monuments of terror. Flayed skins, broadcast executions, you name it, and everything worked. Crime vanished not through justice, but sheer terror. When the Emperor arrived, he found a world that was pacified, silent, and obedient. He saw Curze's methods, deemed them a success, and immediately folded the Night Haunter and his Night Lords into the Great Crusade as the ultimate tool of compliance. The official narrative says this is where it went wrong, because Curze's visions of a burning galaxy drove him insane, that he became a war criminal who couldn't distinguish justice from atrocity, a monster who had to be put down for the good of the Imperium. That's the recorded version. But there is one tiny detail the sanctioned version never explains. The Emperor looked at what Nostromo produced and said, "I don't care." He didn't rehabilitate Curze, he deployed him. That crack in the story is where everything starts to break. Because a Curze who is asking the right questions is far more dangerous than a Curze who is simply mad. A madman can be dismissed, but a philosopher with evidence cannot. Here's what they removed. The central lie of the Imperium is that it is a force for enlightenment, calling itself the bringer of light. But what is its actual primary tool of governance? Fear, the same tool Konrad Curze used. Every single day, across 1,000,000 worlds, the Imperium does exactly what Curze did, and calls it something else. A world that refused compliance? They are not reasoned with, they are bombarded into submission. The Adeptus Arbites don't keep peace through trust. They do it with brutal public crackdowns. The Inquisition does not root out heresy through careful investigation. It does so with purges, torture, and planetary-scale executions that dwarf anything Curze ever personally committed. Exterminatus, penal legions, servitors. These are not the tools of a benevolent empire. They are the instruments of a regime that runs entirely on terror. A fact they would very much prefer you forget. And I know what some of you are thinking. There's a difference between necessary force and sadistic cruelty, because Curze was a monster. The Imperium is just maintaining order. But this is where the counter-argument collapses entirely. What is the functional difference between flaying a rebellious governor to ensure a world's compliance, and virus bombing that same world from orbit? I'm sorry, but what the f— Apologies, Initiate, I get carried away. One is personal, and the other is detached. But both are built on the exact same calculus, that the death of some is an acceptable price for the obedience of all. Curze didn't invent that doctrine, he just refused to dress it up. But something changes. In a pivotal moment, Curze confronted his brother Guilliman and demanded he justify the condemnation. He asked one question: were my methods wrong, or just less comfortable than yours? Guilliman, a great logician, the Primarch of Order and Administration, had no answer. The silence of someone who knew the answer and couldn't say it out loud. Do you see the problem, don't you? Because the answer was, you are correct, Konrad. We just needed someone to blame, and this is where it breaks completely. When Nostromo fell back into corruption after Curze left, he didn't try to fix it, he destroyed it. He performed exterminatus on his own homeworld, the place that made him and the only thing that was ever his. The world that gave him his purpose, his methods, his entire reason for existing, and he burned it from orbit with the cold precision of a man conducting an autopsy on himself. The experiment had proven that fear creates temporary compliance, not lasting change. And so, the experiment had to end. Sit with that for a moment. A man so committed to his own logic that he destroyed the only home he ever had. Not because he hated it, but because the data demanded it. That is not madness. That is a man who thinks exactly like the Imperium, but the Imperium sentenced him to death for it. He wasn't raging against the machine. He just was pointing at it calmly, knowing no one would look. The Emperor saw what Nostromo produced, and then unleashed that method on the galaxy. Curze wasn't an accident. He was an experiment that confirmed the hypothesis: fear works at scale. And then, when the experiment became too visible, when the mirror was held too close, the Imperium didn't correct Curze. It eliminated him. Not for his failure, but for succeeding. And because his existence made it impossible to pretend otherwise. He was the monster they created, condemned for being exactly what they made him, and the Imperium wants you to sit with that. Because the Imperium you call a beacon of humanity sentenced a man to death for saying out loud what it does in silence every single day. And so we come to his end. Unless he already knew. Unless the visions had shown him not just the assassin, but her meaning, which would mean his death wasn't a defeat. His visions had shown him the Calidus assassin Machen was coming. He could have fought, escaped, but he did neither. He waited, and when she arrived, he welcomed her, allowing her to strike him down. His last recorded words weren't a curse, only a question. The same question he had been asking for 10,000 years. He just needed one final answer. If this is true, the Imperium gave him that answer. They sent no brother, healer, or trial, just an assassin. They answered his philosophical challenge with a blade to the throat, using the exact same method he would have used. In his death, Curze held up the mirror one last time and forced the Imperium to kill its own reflection, which would mean the Night Haunter didn't lose. He made his point in the only language the Imperium has ever understood. There are two versions of Konrad Curze. In one, he is a grieving son destroyed by madness, a rabid dog chasing shadows into the dark because he had nothing left to offer. Very tragic, simple, and safe. In the other, he is something colder, a warden who saw clearly enough to understand that some truths cannot be spoken, only demonstrated. A son who despised the hypocrisy of his father, enough to make sure everyone who looked closely would see the lie, even if it cost him everything. The Illuminati Broadcast Network doesn't tell you what to believe. We just make sure you've seen what is actually there. But I want to know where you stand, Initiate. Was Konrad Curze a broken man who deserved his fate? Or was he the only honest son the Emperor ever made? The mirror is shattered, but the reflection remains. This transmission is closed. But the network doesn't stop broadcasting. The next report is already waiting, Initiate, and what it contains is something the Administratum has been trying to bury for 10,000 years. If you are not yet a registered Initiate, the subscribe button is right there. The Council is watching who clicks it. Illuminati Broadcast Network, out.